At the age of 14, he dreamed of seeing history being made. That dream eventually came true. He would report from a total of 10 war zones. He would interview many of the leading newsmakers of his era, including Nelson Mandela, Margaret Thatcher, Salman Rushdie, and Henry Kissinger, and he would be acclaimed for his decades of reporting for the CBC. But today the subject isn't a foreign war or some international figure. This time, it's himself. Here to talk about his new memoir, On the Ground, My Life as a Foreign Correspondent, is Brian Stewart. Welcome.
Thank you, John. Nice to be here.
Well, they say in TV news that you should open with your strongest visuals, and the book opens with perhaps the best-known example of your reporting, and that's the famine in Ethiopia in the 1980s. Did you have any idea what you were getting into and what kind of reaction your coverage would inspire?
Certainly not the reaction. I had some idea what I'd be getting into, but not nearly enough. When we broke into northern Ethiopia, it had been sort of a famine cut off from the outside world, kept cut off by the government of the day, the Marxist regime of Ethiopia in 1984. I prepared all I could to sort of imagine a famine, read about famines, but when I got in, it was beyond anything I could visually imagine. It was like a world after a nuclear holocaust, apocalypse, absolutely. Dust clouds across the roads and bodies on the side of roads, feeding centers where people were dying in their hundreds every day. It was just impossible to imagine, not just the starkness of it, but the breadth of it. I mean, famine is not just like a war in one city or a war in one area. It was spread across much of northern Ethiopia, risking the lives of 7 million people. It's very hard to get your mind around that. And I certainly, when I did the report, I knew we were going to be one of the first two reports in the world out, because BBC were already on the ground as well as ourselves. And I knew it had to be as strong a report as I could possibly make it, because the audiences would tire after a few days. So this had to be really strong. And we really worked hard in those first few days to get out a report that did, in fact, shake Canada when it arrived.
Now, your coverage centered around the haunting image of one starving child in particular. Soon the world would come to know Birhan Wuldu. What did you hope telling her story would do?
Well, when I came across Birhan Wuldu when she appeared to have died already. She had a young 3-year-old girl. Her father had slumped to a pavement in a feeding center. I thought she was dying. We had already seen so much death that it was almost normal, except there was something about her face that really stood out. I called the nurse and said, can we please try and save this girl if we can? She was raced into a small medical center where the nurse told us, I'm sorry, there's nothing we can really do. She'll be dead within hours. And we were filming her last gasp when I told the crew to step outside. We wanted her to die in peace. But in her face, through her eyes, she seemed almost to be symbolic of Ethiopia itself, appealing to an ungenerous world to respond to cries for help. And I did a piece, I went back hours later to cover her burial, and she was alive. They'd given her one last needle, she comes alive. I do a story on life, the survival of this girl is perhaps symbolic of Ethiopia's ability to survive even the famine. Little did I know it, that clip of her face became world famous when it was played later on Live Aid by Bob Geldof and David Bowie and others, went around the world to an audience of about 1.1 billion. And she became the face of famine. Years later, I went back to try and find her. I did find her. And I did a documentary on her, and basically we've been in touch ever since. It was a remarkable human story.
So you're still in touch with her today?
Indeed. I helped her through schooling, and her family got a house. So I've been sort of involved with the same kind of charity she has been working on in northern Ethiopia for many years. So we're still involved there. But we've got to a point now where our families are friends. So we actually Zoom back and forth on weekends occasionally. Her husband and their 2 children and my family will sort of speak to them via Zoom. It's just such a remarkable arc of time and arc of technology.
Now, on the 20th anniversary of Live Aid, you tell the story of finding yourself next to Birhan on Oprah's famous yellow couch. What was that like?
Well, funny enough, for me, it was terrifying. I was decades in television. I found it a quite terrifying experience. First of all, I found this couch very slippery. I thought I was going to slip off it at one stage, which would have been a first for television. She was completely calm no matter what circumstance she was in. Months earlier, she'd been on this Live Aid 2 stage with Madonna dancing and helping to raise funds again. She took everything in her stride, was completely calm, and we had a remarkable reunion. But very quickly, she emphasized to me when the show was over, look, I have exams to write back in Ethiopia. I got to get home. And she sort of turned her back on all the world's fame and celebrity she had at that stage and went back to finish her degree as both in medicine and also agriculture. She wanted to work with the poorest farmers and farm families in Ethiopia, which she's doing to this day with a charity of her own.
Is it striking to you what kind of effect and what kind of influence that coverage continues to have?
Yeah, I think the most striking thing to me about it was the way it hits Canada. Canada reacted basically first and foremost in the entire world. Historian of that period has said that the CBC report, my report on November the 1st, 1984, struck Canada like a tsunami. It was such a shockwave across the country. And the government of the day, Brian Mulroney, and the people of Canada got together in this remarkable alliance, not only to try and help Ethiopia by itself, but to rally the world behind it. So Mulroney sent his ambassador to the UN, Stephen Lewis, down there to raise hell, get the world on side. And actually, long before even the wonderful British response, the Canadians responded in a way which I think has never been equaled in peacetime before and or since, and I doubt ever will be again, because everybody was so on side. And it was such a poignant moment in history. It changed the whole atmosphere of the 1980s. The Canadian response, the British response, the musicians, the Live Aid, and the rest of it. So a huge upwelling of humanitarian effort, humanitarian groups. So it became, in effect, a very good story from one of the worst horrible stories I'd ever covered in my life. And of course, some of that influence is still there. There are many people working in aid and humanitarian relief around the world who were electrified in that fall and winter, 84, 85, by these news accounts and also by the humanitarian reaction.
Now, from Ethiopia, we go right back to the beginning. You say you caught the news bug at the age of 14 while living in London in 1956, which on balance was quite the year for news and indeed history. Tell me about Radio Free Brian.
Well, I was going to a boarding school, but fortunately I was a day student because we lived only 2 blocks away. So at night I was mesmerized by the TV coverage of the Suez Crisis War and the Hungarian uprising, and also by cultural events like the arrival of Elvis Presley on the scene, which we never heard of before. So I would go in every day, and of course the students weren't getting any news at all, and the masters were usually ill-informed too, as well. So I would become kind of like a Radio Free Brian over lunch and tea breaks and the rest of it. I'd be telling them what's going on in the world, and British troops are about to land at Port Said, and Hungary, Budapest is in a full uprising. And there's this amazing singer called Elvis Presley. We don't know what he looks like, but we know he's got a song out called Heartbreak Hotel. So that was my kind of role at the time. And I had decided after seeing this on television that I wanted to be there where history was being made. So I wrote an essay one of the first weeks after seeing these wars break out, saying when I grow up, I want to be a foreign correspondent, which I was regarded as madness by the masters and by my fellow students to boot. Nobody really quite understood why anybody would want to do this, but I saw, well, who doesn't want to sit at the ringside seat of history and see remarkable things happen before you? Unfortunately, at times I got closer to the ring than I ever expected or planned on, but you have to take your risk and reward as it comes.
There's a great line of yours in the book. I like telling people the latest. It made me feel alive. I think that's a good line for any one of us who enters this business.
It is, I think even before I was 14, as a kid, I grew up in an era, I was born in the middle of the Second World War. I grew up in the post-war era and the Cold War era, where when you go to a movie, there was always newsreels playing. All families had newspapers arriving. Everybody was kind of reading on the same page. So I grew up in a very newsy time, and I thought, wow, to cover the news just must be the most exciting thing in the world. And in fact, it turned out to be pretty much the most exciting thing in the world to do. It was the only career I was really suited for. I can't imagine what else I could have been in life, but this was one that I was just made for, and gave me not only some of the worst moments of my life, but also some of the most pleasurable and fun and amusing moments.
Now, you got your start in newspapers. One of your early assignments was covering the 1968 Liberal leadership race. You say that you may have been the first person to use the term Trudeau-mania, maybe even coin it, but that you feel almost petty pointing it out now. Why is that?
Well, first of all, I had just come back from England, 2 years in London on a newspaper in the Beatle area. Everybody in England was calling everything a mania, Beatlemania, this and whatever. So I get back and I sent on the Trudeau campaign, and it struck me when I was on it that, well, there were screaming young girls and young women, and there were crowds of very enthusiastic people, somewhat manipulated by organizers and the rest of it. And I thought, well, it's like a kind of low-grade Trudeau-mania. So I write a story at Trudeau's biggest rally in Toronto, and I said, this wasn't all Trudeau-mania. So I just put it in without thinking much. I got back to the paper later that day in Montreal, and then a very grumpy city editor came up to me and said, why did you have to use that word? Now it's out there and all around the media. Everybody started using it, which will give this awful guy a tremendous advantage. So I was made to feel guilty by my editors almost immediately. So I never felt particularly proud of having done it. And to this day, I'm a little embarrassed, quite frankly. Certainly knowing the misuse to which it was subjected at times.
Now, much later in the book, you talk about leading an investigative unit for the Journal, and one of your assignments brought you here to Vancouver to look into the causes of the 1985 Air India bombings. This is 2 years later, when it seemed like no one was doing anything about it or even talking about it in terms of getting to the bottom of it at the time. How was it regarded at that time in that contemporary feeling?
Well, it was sort of a huge terror attack. In fact, it was the biggest terror attack in the world up to that time, certainly the biggest in the air. It was, hundreds were killed. It was sort of an ongoing investigation that seemed to be getting nowhere. And I had done a lot of investigative work in Ottawa and always investigated the Mounties, the RCMP, fairly well. So I just started investigating for the Journal with a very good producer and crew. And fairly soon we came across this remarkable story that a source told us, that tapes of the bombing suspects, the very strong suspects, had been erased by the new security service, CSIS, and partially by RCMP. So there was some kind of weird cover-up going on. So I was able to break a story that, remarkably, the RCMP had very strong evidence of pre-planning of what was going on before the bombing. And I thought this was a real intelligence scandal. And it was a huge story at the time, but has since been, has grown because of other investigations into the Air India bombing, have proven the case that there was a terrible, terrible police mismatch and screw up in this investigation, which was quite tragic and very hard on the families of the victims. They had to live through these years of no resolution, nobody explaining what went wrong and how it could have gone wrong. So it was a very sad story, and it was really a shocker for our security services in this country. They had to work better and they had to work together.
Your reporting basically foreshadowed what the public inquiry would get around to 25 years later, it seems. Was that upsetting to you that it took so long to get to the bottom of this?
It was very upsetting. It was always a story that was just about to be explained, and then there'd be more studies to be done. And it went on and on. And, the fact of the matter is everybody, I'll take that back, not everybody, but a lot of people in the media, as well as in the security services, knew very well who was behind the bombing, what was behind it, what group was behind it. And they had so botched the evidence gathering that they were afraid to take them to trial. And it was quite possible that nobody would ever be charged. And basically, most of those involved were never seriously charged. So it was a tragedy in many ways, and it's never, it still is an ongoing tragedy because so few people were paid the price for this terrible crime.
Now,
Which just was a shock to the whole country of Canada, as well as the parents of victims and the rest of it.
of course, the heart of the book is your time as a foreign correspondent. You point out that in one 8-month span, you went from covering the famine in Ethiopia to the war in Lebanon, then the miners' strike in England, and then soccer hooliganism. What kind of toll does that take on a person?
Well, it was taking a lot more of a toll than I was aware at the time. But there was a lot of fatigue factor. Ethiopia just was physically exhausting, and we kept going back to Ethiopia and to other famines in Africa as well. So I knew of the exhaustion of it all. But the mix of good stories and bad stories, I also covered the Pope's first visit to Canada in that same period. So you were going up and down the great events, awful events, the rest of it. Psychologically, we didn't realize how big a toll it was taking. Years later, I was to find out, as many correspondents, foreign correspondents have in recent decades, that there's a scar tissue that builds up in psychologically and also emotionally and spiritually that can make you pay a very, very heavy price. It has to be dealt with professionally and skillfully, which wasn't done at that time I was writing about then.
You talk about becoming patient zero of a landmark study, the first ever to investigate the trauma and the psychological damage risked by foreign correspondents. Now, in your case, you didn't suffer from PTSD as such, but something called conversion disorder. What is that, and what happened there?
Well, no, conversion disorder was one aspect of what a deeper symptom that has pretty much grown in the last 10 years, called moral injury, which very much has the same symptoms as PTSD, but isn't PTSD when you're tested for it. As most journalists don't get it, surprisingly. And I didn't get PTSD, but I did seem to have moral injury. And what that is, it's not a psychological mental illness, but it's what famous psychiatrist in Toronto, Anthony Feinstein, is called a wound of the soul, which affects those who witness over and over and over again these appalling horror scenes of death and destruction and awful, appalling brutality towards civilians and suffering of every description. Well, you witness that over and over again. You come away very frequently thinking, okay, I did a good report and the report was fine enough as far as it goes, but as a human being, what did I do? I didn't do anything. I just sort of stood there and watched all these things happening. And this built up so that even decades after, say, covering Ethiopia, I was having flashbacks to scenes where I thought I could have stepped out and helped somebody on the side of a road, helped a refugee family that was clearly starving, but they were among 5,000 other families. Or maybe I could have reached in a pocket and pulled some coins out to help this person or that person. And you're continually shaken by these images of you didn't quite live up to the moral standard you had set yourself through your own values. It doesn't only affect foreign correspondents, it affects a lot of aid workers, humanitarians, affects a lot of soldiers as well. And it's very hard sometimes to be in these situations and frankly not feel a bit guilty, because there's always things you're not doing that you think, well, maybe I could have done. And that comes to prey on you. What do you need help with in that situation is therapy. And fortunately, I had very good therapy after a serious breakdown. I had excellent therapy and I managed to deal with it. But some correspondents, to my knowledge, have never dealt with it and have paid just a ghastly price.
Now, you talk about reporting at a time, as you put it, when Canadian journalism was flourishing and had not yet begun the decades-long retreat it appears trapped in today. Do you miss it at all?
I miss the time I lived in because I'm a very nostalgic person, but I don't miss doing it today by any means. I think foreign correspondents out there today have a much tougher, more busier, more chaotic existence than we did back in the 80s and 90s and into the new century, in the first 10 years. Everything speeded up so much. The vortex of ever spinning 24/7 news gyrations, which I'm sure you know all about. You must get an awful lot of it yourself, but it's so constant. And also, there have been cutbacks to the profession of foreign correspondents, I think quite tragically, and in Canada's case, quite scandalously. So that the foreign correspondents who are out there, very good ones indeed, as good as any in history, they're just overwhelmed by the work or the lack of time, the lack of time they get to spend in one area before they have to move on to another. So I wouldn't want to be working out there today. If I could get in a time machine and go back and work on some of the times in the 80s, I would certainly jump aboard, but only for a limited space of time, maybe for a couple of weeks. It can be a very fulfilling life. It was certainly for me, but it also can be quite unhealthy.
Any words of advice for journalists who want to become foreign correspondents now?
Most of all, take it really seriously. I mean, study the craft inside out before you undertake it. Take courses that are available through journalism schools on war training. Most serious networks will give the future foreign correspondents this training, how to react in the field to a gunfire, being under attack, kidnapping offenses, that kind of thing. But I would really urge you to think very seriously, what is your risk level? How much are you willing to risk for a story that many people won't even remember 5 years from now? And take a very serious attitude towards it. Now, people who go through that and say, absolutely, but I still want to sit at the ringside seat of history because I think being a witness is good, and I think it's also essential and necessary in the world. I applaud that. Go for it, because the world absolutely does need good foreign correspondents that shine a light in the darkness. And boy, there's a lot of darkness in the world now.
What do you hope people get out of the book?
Well, I hope they don't see it as just a dire read, because there was a lot of fun to it. We saw very exciting times indeed. I hope they'll get a sense that, Canada had a period in the 80s and 90s when really it was a golden age of foreign coverage. All the networks, not just Canadian, but they really reached a pinnacle because of new technology and the competition of networks to be out there and really covering world news. We've lost a lot of that. I hope they get out of it the sense that Canada's got to do a much better job in terms of the numbers out there being supported out there than it's doing right now, because we're in danger of becoming a myopic country. Too few foreign correspondents, no intelligence service of our own working abroad, a slimmed down diplomatic service. No wonder we're often out to lunch when new developments happen in the world. So I hope they'll also see it as a serious call to better coverage of the world through all methods for Canada.
The name of the book is On the Ground, My Life as a Foreign Correspondent. It's published by Simon & Schuster. My thanks to author Brian Stewart.
Thank you, John. Enjoyed it.